for coming today. This is a fantastic turnout. My name is Wendy Rolleder-Sook, and I'm the chair of the Department of Communication Studies, Law, and Political Science. We are honored to host the American Democracy Project, who is sponsoring and hosting this event today. And I'm going to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jay Steinmetz, who's an associate professor of political science in our department, and he's talking about the 2024 election results. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to Jay.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to see you all. This is an important talk, and I'm not surprised that there are a number of people here. I'm sure many of you are asking questions about why we got what we got. And that's where the role of a political scientist really comes in. We're not very good predictors. We're not Nostradamus. It's not our job to tell you what's going to happen in the future. But it is our job as social scientists in the political realm to tell you why we see certain things in politics, and to sort of dig into the data and dig into the evidence and to kind of provide some explanations. And that's what I want to do in this talk. I'm going to provide for you a number of different theories as to why we saw what we saw in the 2024 election. A very historic election, obviously, a very important one. We have now the first non-consecutive serving president of 2 terms since Grover Cleveland of the 19th century. We have a return of Trump Republican Party and what that means for not just the nation, not just the world, but also the Republican Party. I think it's very transformative, and there are a lot of really important and critical questions that we can ask, and critical insights that can be derived from looking at the elections data. So first of all, the results are in, but what does it mean? Why? Why do we have what we have? Is this a Republican Party success? Is this a Democratic Party failure? A little bit of both, obviously. But which one has more explanatory power? Meaning, which one sort of is where the weight really resides in terms of what we saw, Is this really fundamentally a Republican Party success or a Democratic Party failure? Which one is more powerful in terms of its explanation? Well, first of all, we have nearly the same record turnout as the 2020 election. The results, we're still counting in some states, particularly California. I think there's maybe about 7 or 8% left of the vote left to count in California. But it looks like the total number of votes is going to be fairly close, underneath, but fairly close to that 2020 record turnout. So we have, in some sense, about the same number, total number. Now, caution you right away, that does not mean you have the same voters from 2020 that are voting in 2024. The American electorate actually shifts and changes in pretty substantial ways. People move from one state to another in very large numbers. Lots of people are coming in terms of becoming 18 years old in that 4-year period of time who are now new voters. People are not voting, et cetera, et cetera. The electorate is shifting a lot. So we can't just say because the numbers are the same, we're having the same voters, and we're seeing the exact same voters shift over from the Democratic Party column in this case to the Republican Party column in this case. There are some voters, and I want to isolate exactly what we're looking at in terms of the decline in Democratic voting numbers and the success across the board, I think, pretty much conclusively for the Republican Party. That exists in the House and in the Senate, as well as the race for the presidency. The Republicans have now captured the House of Representatives. I put the likelihood of the Republicans capturing the House at probably about a 50%. I thought it was a toss-up as to whether or not the Democrats would actually get the majority in the House or the Republicans would retain the majority in the House. So not a big surprise there. In the Senate, we had a number of swing states, obviously, that were very, very crucial for the control of the Senate, but the map in the Senate for the Democratic Party was always a disadvantage. The Democratic Party was always working against the headwinds in the U.S. Senate, particularly because it was a near certainty they were going to lose the seat in West Virginia. There's no Democrat at the level of Joe Manchin that's going to be competing with a Republican candidate in West Virginia, a solidly conservative state that goes Donald Trump by, 40 percentage points. So that one was certainly going to the Republican Party column, was going to be a seat that was going to be flipped, a state that would be flipped. That immediately puts the Republicans in control of a majority of the Senate. With John Tester behind in the polls in Montana consistently for weeks, it looked like John Tester was going to lose the Montana Senate seat, and indeed he did. Aside from those two, I would say that the Democrats kind of held their own in the Senate. Alyssa Slotkin won an open seat in Michigan. Tammy Baldwin held onto her seat in Wisconsin. Jackie Rosen held onto her seat in Nevada. Ruben Gallego beat Carrie Lake in Arizona. Those are all Democratic wins in those states. And while they ultimately did lose the Senate, it looks like 53, could be 54 with McCormick. I know he's up by about 20,000 votes or so in Pennsylvania. I would say that not a Democratic Party win, but they held in some critical states. It's going to be a Republican Party majority in the Senate, Republican Party majority in the House, and of course the presidency went the way of Donald Trump and the Republicans. Trump showed noticeable improvement from 2020, particularly among Hispanic, Latino voters, black voters, and younger voters. Those are the demographics that we saw a huge boost. And I'm going to look at the map, and we're going to kind of isolate where geographically those are located. But we see a significant rightward shift across the country in county by county data, especially in more liberal areas and especially in big cities. We saw huge shifts toward the Republican Party in cities like Philadelphia, New York City, Milwaukee, Atlanta, and other places. And we have to ask why that's the case and what that means for politics in the future. But it's a major change, a big change, a right-wing shift that's noticeable that we can see. We had 74.2 million votes for Donald Trump in 2020, projected around 76 or so, maybe a little bit under that for 2024 in Trump, for Trump in 2024. A noticeable improvement, that is a noticeable improvement, but not a kind of watershed transformative performance by Donald Trump. Fairly in line with, I think, the trajectory of Trump politics and the support base and the kind of expansion of that support base that he has. Aside from his core supporters, which I would put at maybe around 35% of his voters, you have a fluctuating mix of moderate Republicans, of independents, and others, younger voters who are maybe ambivalent, not affiliated with a party, who've decided to vote for Donald Trump. That's the kind of expansive, elastic part of the Trump electorate that can grow and that can shrink. And it certainly grew in 2024. I'm not sure what the limitations are for Trump's growth in the future or for a kind of Trump Republican Party in the future, but we'll talk about that here at the end of the talk. So a significant rightward shift. Joe Biden garnered 81.2 million votes in 2020. Harris projected around 73 million votes in 2024. The takeaway here, I think, just looking at the numbers, is that Harris significantly underperformed from Joe Biden's performance in 2020. And I would say that that's probably the more significant element here. This has more powerful explanatory power. The collapse of Democratic Party support in 2024 relative to 2020. And I think a lot of the collapse of that Democratic support are in those younger voters, in demographics of black voters, especially black voters in rural areas of America, Hispanic Latino voters, especially in Florida and Texas. That's where we see kind of big declines in the overall numbers. Now these overall numbers, we're not talking about the swing states. We're not talking about the Electoral College map. That's how a president is selected. A president is not selected through a nationwide popular vote, right? It's the Electoral College map that matters. This is going to be very significant in analyzing how the Democratic Party performed or underperformed in 2024. In my opinion, the Electoral College map, it warps a lot of our politics. It makes our politics have unique outcomes that otherwise wouldn't have been the case. And one of the elements here specifically is that the Democrats especially spend an inordinate amount of money and time and effort in just the swing states and kind of ignored those other states. So when we see the collapse in these numbers nationally, we're looking at huge collapse in areas, in states that are not swing states, in areas that are not considered competitive. Illinois, for example, a 650,000 vote decline in Democratic votes in the state of Illinois. Cook County alone, the county of Chicago, Illinois, huge decline in Democratic support. I suspect, I get a feeling that a lot of those votes are from voters who feel as though their votes were wasted in a critical election that they might have cared about, but an election that they felt they couldn't do much about, being that they were a resident of Illinois, a state that was safe, a state that really is not going to determine ultimately who wins the Electoral College. I think we see that across the map, especially for the Democrats. But that brings up an interesting question. Why the Democrats, why not the Republicans in those same non-swing states, like states like Oklahoma, et cetera, et cetera? We don't see the same collapse in the voter support. I think that we have to talk about that a little bit and the nature of these campaigns a little bit underneath, the nature of the parties and the parties running these campaigns a little bit more. So why? Why this nationwide rightward shift in 2024? The Democratic Party collapse is the bigger, broader picture of what we're looking at, or the thing that has more explanatory power. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on the collapse of Democratic Party votes. I've got here 5 theories that we'll look at in detail. The immigration backlash theory, the identity politics theory, the Joe Biden theory, it's the economy stupid theory, and the establishment versus the anti-establishment theory. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of a spoiler, and that is that the one that I think has the most explanatory power of these theories is the last one. And I think the one that has the weakest explanatory power is the first one. And it goes in this gradation, okay? So this is the story I'm going to tell through these theories, is that these, while important, are not the game changers of the 2024 election. Not the thing that really ultimately decides who won the presidency. The thing that ultimately decides who wins the presidency are going to be these down here. These are going to have much more powerful explanatory power, okay? Does that make sense? So we're going to kind of go in order of those that I think are important. They're obviously very critical and important to politics, but I don't think have the kind of power, that I don't think are the powerful factors that ultimately led to who won the presidency and who did not win the presidency. Okay, so let's talk about that immigration theory a little bit. Well, border politics, first of all, is for the Trump movement, for Trump voters. Border politics is not just about the border, okay? The border is symbolic or is connected to a whole bunch of other policy concerns that Trump supporters hold. The border is connected to our drug crisis, fentanyl overdose crisis, crime in this country. It's connected to national security imperatives, a whole bunch of other policy avenues. And I think it's important to reflect on that, especially for progressives or independents or those who are outside of the Trump political movement. You might think, well, the border is only one aspect of American politics. But it is connected to all these other aspects for Trump voters. And appreciating that, I think, goes a long way toward understanding the salience of this issue for the Trump movement, the salience of the border. So it's not just about the border, and it's not just about immigration either. It's about crime, and it's about drugs, it's about national security, it's about all these other things that I mentioned. We had a phenomenon of migrant busing. This was Governor Abbott in Texas, but there were other instances of this happening, Governor DeSantis in Florida as well, in which from a large numbers of migrant flows from the southern border into the United States of America, Republican governors sought to bring the politics of the border to non-border areas of this country, trying to highlight the importance or the crisis of the border toward areas of this country that are far removed from our southern border. Hence, migrant busing to New York City, to other more predominantly liberal areas of this country. This was kind of laughed at and derided by a lot of those on the left, by a lot of those progressives, or kind of ridiculed and criticized and then sort of ignored. I want to suggest to you that this, although controversial all the time, appears to have been effective in our political conversations, in our public conversations, and seems to have some kind of effect. I'm still digging into trying to draw the connections between the numbers we're seeing and the motivations as to why we got those numbers, but I think this has a substantial effect in cities like New York City, where we had a huge turn toward Trump voters. In fact, Queens and Bronx, those two counties in New York City, are two of the largest percentages of shifts toward the Republican Party in the 2024 elections. 26% for Queens, 25% for Bronx, New York. A 26% shift from the Democrats to the Republicans. Obviously, Queens still went for the Democratic Party in terms of the majority number of votes, but that shift is massive and huge. And I think it says something about the nature of working class politics, voters for Trump, but not necessarily Republican voters, traditional conservative Republican voters, but newer voters who decided to vote maybe in particular just for Trump. And I think we need to ask why. We saw a lot of split ticket voting here amongst Republicans. We saw a lot of folks voting to protect abortion rights in states that had abortion on the ballot, but voting for Trump. We saw a lot of voters not vote for Senate candidates or down ballot Republicans, but vote for Donald Trump. And I think that says something about the nature of Trump's populist message and what he is as a political figure in this country, and how he attracts a lot of folks who do live outside of the political ecosystem most of their lives. They're not paying attention to politics all the time. They're not always connected to policy and what's happening. They're not constantly reading the political news. But they're seeing other things and other forces in life that are compelling them and drawing them toward the Trump movement. I think we should look deeply into that. But overall, I don't find a lot of compelling evidence that the politics of immigration or the politics of the border was the game changer that brought Trump back to the White House. Exit polls from PBS show 2 out of 10 voters felt that immigration was the top issue that they were voting for, compared to 4 out of 10 for the economy and other issues. Now that's the PBS exit poll. I've been looking at other exit polls that show the economy at more like 6 out of 10. 5 out of 10 or 6 out of 10. It looks like the economy seems to be a much more driving force for a lot of voters than immigration when you compare the two. And then also abortion as well. Abortion from some exit polls range from less than 1 to around 1 out of 10 voters that went to the polls solely because of the issue or policy of abortion. There are conflicting polls on undocumented immigration and what it means to the American public. 56% of Americans support mass deportations from August 2024 Pew poll, but 58% of Americans support a pathway to citizenship for some undocumented persons who meet certain requirements. The support for DACA dreamers is in the 70 percentile. The support for Joe Biden's executive order, which was recently struck down by a Texas judge, that would provide protection for undocumented persons who are married to U.S. citizens or have children who are U.S. citizens. The support for that is really high amongst the public. So there's in other words, there's some conflicting viewpoints here. The data is not on one side of this issue or on the other. I think that suggests to me that the American public has some conflictions themselves, like even individuals not quite sure what they think about this entirely. I think a lot of folks who are supportive of mass deportations think of mass deportations in the context of recent migratory patterns, recent undocumented individuals who have crossed the border, the migrant busing, for example, in big cities and other things, connects to that, and that's the connection that I think a lot of voters, not all, but I think that there are some voters who are making those connections. And they're maybe not appreciating the fact that, Trump's campaign promises of mass deportation have not ruled out undocumented persons who have been living in this country for decades, who are married to U.S. citizens, have U.S. children. There is no pathway for them to remedy an undocumented status in the immigration system. There is nothing in our law that allows undocumented persons to remedy that situation within the country. The only real solution, they have 2 options for all undocumented persons, but I'm thinking especially of folks who have long lived here in the United States, who are married to American citizens, have children who are American citizens and work here, et cetera, et cetera. You've got 2 options, basically. You could continue to do what you're doing and remain undocumented and go about living your life, or you can leave the country and try to enter the country through the legal process. Now, the problem with that, especially if you have children, but with spouses as well, is that you're going to not be able to see your family for years, potentially. The legal immigration takes a long time. And even if you have children, and even if you're married to a U.S. citizen, the length of time that it takes to wait can be 6 or 7 or even 8 years long. And so imagine if you have to leave because you're undocumented, your child is 6 years old, you may have to leave, and when you come back, your child will be 15, 14 years old by the time you see them again. And so that's obviously a really, really difficult choice that, and frankly, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people are faced with that question. And so I think that goes into the nature of the conflicting polls here. I think that a lot of Americans are genuinely conflicted about this. I think a lot of Americans have legitimate concerns and worries about current migration in the United States and other issues that might be connected to the southern border. But they're also conflicted about long-term implications of what this means for a lot of people that live in their communities, people that they may know, people that they're connected to, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think it's a genuinely conflicting issue. One of the more interesting aspects of this that I'll highlight right now is that although I think that immigration politics, clearly on the minds of many voters, is not the significant enough of an issue to be the principal factor in Trump's success in the Electoral College, I do think that Trump as President-elect Trump, coming into office in 2025, immigration politics is going to be at the center of his government, and is going to be an issue that will not go away at all. It's up to Republicans, I think, in Congress especially, to figure out whether or not they want to protect the dreamers, the DACA dreamers, in ways that are actually codified in law, that can be actually durable protections, and what they do about undocumented persons that are married to U.S. citizens and married to or having children who are U.S. citizens. There's an argument to be made that the Texas judge decision to strike down the executive order makes sense. It does seem to exceed the presidential authority of executive orders. It does seem something much, much more applicable to congressional statutory law, that Congress passes a law to protect those individuals and provide a pathway to either them staying in the country or reconciling their undocumented status in one way or another through actual congressional law. But it's going to be up to Republicans to figure that out. It's going to be a conversation with a unified government Republican Party majority to figure out. Okay, the identity politics theory here. There's a lot of different facets and a lot of different avenues to this theory. On the one hand, we might argue that racism, misogyny, hatred of women, anti-LGBTQ or anti-trans movements really brought voters to the polls, mobilized voters, dampened enthusiasm for Kamala Harris. There is a strong notion out there said by many that Harris, being a woman, held to a different standard than Donald Trump. Not just a woman, but a person of color as well. And that those disadvantages, well, maybe unconscious for a lot of voters, were real and tangible. That here is an eminently qualified person who looks like a pretty normal politician in many ways. Whereas Donald Trump, I mean, love him or hate him, doesn't look like a normal politician in a lot of ways. That part of the disadvantage Kamala Harris had in this matchup was the fact that she was a woman, and a black woman, an Asian American woman, and that those factors had a role to play. Identity politics broadly, if I can provide a definition for you all, that it is the notion that group identities, not individual identities, but group affiliation is the site of political action and political justice and political change. That our identities shared in groups forms the basis of how we engage in politics. There's always been an identity politics. It maybe hasn't always been as strong and as salient and as visible in American politics as it has been since the rise of Barack Obama in 2008. I do think that Barack Obama brought a kind of age of identity, the importance of identity as a kind of foundational feature to party politics, electoral politics, and policy in America. And that's been with us for what we might call this like moment in our political time over the past maybe 20 years or 15 years or so. There's always been an identity politics, but I don't think it's always been as strong or salient as I mentioned before. I also want to point out too, I think it's fair to say that Trump's anti-identity politics is itself a form of identity politics. And not all of his identity politics is anti-identity politics. There are a lot of positive affirmations of particular identities that underpin the Trump political movement. So I don't think that Trump is just a reaction to identity politics. I think it is a continuation in many ways of identity politics. If we had a much more conventional conservative Republican candidate, maybe like a Nikki Haley or a Mitt Romney or something, I would be much more open to the idea that the Republican Party is providing a reaction to identity politics and not just kind of playing the identity politics game. I see Donald Trump as a continuation of our identity politics world in many ways. The takeaway here, gender and race do not explain much, actually, and some of these things are a surprise. A lot of us were expecting the gender divide, which so many people have been talking about, in which women are increasingly siding with the Democratic Party and men are increasingly siding with the Republican Party, to exacerbate and grow larger with the results of the 2024 election. And that is not what we saw. We didn't see the gender gap narrow, but we didn't see it grow larger either. In fact, we saw remarkably mirrored movements of men and women voters from 2024 to 2020. I'll look at some graphics here on the next slide that show that. I also think that because quite obviously Trump improved his vote share among Black and Hispanic Latino voters, I'm not so sure that these elements of racism, division, nativism, however you want to call it, had a strong role to play within the Trump success of the Electoral College. Again, I'm not saying these aren't important issues. I'm not saying they're not salient. I also think that these issues might not go away and become exacerbated, might become more spotlit in a 2025 Trump administration and in our future. But in terms of the Electoral College win of 2024, I'm not seeing in the data that this was really the game changer. This was the thing that really made the movement in this in this way. There is a caveat here, and the caveat is that anti-trans politics seems to have an effect. Fully over 1/3 of the Trump campaign's ad buys at the height of the ad buying season of October were anti-trans ads. They were very explicit. They seem to have a powerful effect. Over 1/3, that was approximately $65 million spent by the Trump campaign on anti-trans advertisements and commercials. The Harris campaign did a focus group in late October with a number of swing and undecided voters, and they were exposed to these anti-trans ads. They measured a 2.7% likelihood of them switching over, 2.7% drift toward the Republican Party with exposure to these ads. That showed the Harris campaign as well that these ads were effective. These ads really did the work that they were intended to do, which was to show the Democrats as out of touch, as beholden to particular sort of coalitions of identities that don't speak to the whole of the country, and kind of underpin some of the weaknesses within the Democratic Party. I think that as well, these ads were particularly effective with younger voters, with voters who are non-white, not traditional conservative Republican voters. These ads appealed to many of these voters, not all, but many of these voters appealed to this particular message, this kind of anti-identity politics message. So I think it was effective. Clearly, the Trump campaign made it central to their campaign, and clearly, the Trump campaign was successful. So that correlation doesn't equal causation is true, but I think there's some good evidence to suggest that it had some role to play in Donald Trump's success. Some visuals here just to show you kind of the mirrors, the gender gap between the parties. You know, a 3% increase for men and women amongst Trump of all age categories, both men and women, same movement. A 2% decline for women from Biden to Harris, a slightly more decline for men from 2020 to 2024. But, you know, we're seeing this gap much more substantial, and the movement much more substantial. The younger generation, I'll show you another visual here on the next slide that will show that. Support for Harris and abortion access here. You can see the gap. Abortion access, the support to protect abortion, much more significant than the vote share for the Harris campaign for Democrats more broadly down ballot, but this in particular is just for the Harris presidential campaign. So abortion access in Maryland, 75% of those in Maryland supported protecting abortion, only 62% voted for Harris. You can see the gap here in Colorado and New York. Those are states that Harris won. The states that Trump won, 47%, 47%. These are definitely underperforming for Biden's numbers of 2020 and really show a substantial gap here. These are states that are swing states. These are states that a lot of political ads are being spent in, a lot of politics are being talked about. These are states that are in no means like Republican Party strongholds. In fact, both of these states have been trending toward the Democratic Party for several years in the Obama administration. We saw a clear right-wing turn in terms of the presidential race, but we also saw substantial numbers that supported abortion in both of those states. Montana, pretty significant, huge gap, 20% gap there, 50% supporting abortion access, only 38% supporting Kamala Harris. In Florida, I think there were some big surprises. Florida, of course, you had a governor who spent a lot of taxpayer dollars in Florida weighing in on this issue, both this and recreational marijuana, and trying to push both of those issues toward no ballot measure votes. And it looks like Ron DeSantis was ultimately very successful, and they did a pretty good job. 57% was not sufficient, that's not successful. In Florida law, it was a 60% threshold. So they needed to get over 60%. They didn't quite get there. This shows significant majority support for abortion access and rights, but according to Florida law, wouldn't ultimately realize into abortion protections. 43% vote share for Harris in Florida as well, and down the list of the states that were not really swing states, not very competitive, showed the same kind of gap. Again, the gender gap here, I'm just showing you the kind of mirror movements going on with men and women. Men and women between the ages of 45 and 64. A slight increase for Trump, a slight decrease from Biden to Harris. Men and women between the ages of 30 and 44, a more substantial and more visible increase for Donald Trump. And here you see an actual increase relative to men for women. Women increasing 5% in this age category relative to a 3% increase for men. A decline in men's vote share from Biden to Harris of 5%, and then for women from Biden to Harris of 2% in that age category. But it's the younger demographic where you really see a noticeable difference. And again, I think this shows you that this is not about gender here, this is about age, okay? This indicates that younger voters did not come out for the Democratic Party very much in swing states, in non-swing states, across the map in a lot of different areas. Huge increase, 15% increase of men between the ages of 18 and 29 voting for Donald Trump from 2020 to 2024. Same candidate, Trump, 15% increase. Women, a 7% increase over that same period of time in that age category of 18 to 29. A 7% decline of women from Biden to Harris in 20 to 2024, and a 14% decline in men. So mirror opposites in terms of increase and decrease, and mirror opposite and paralleling each other in terms of comparing between men and women. It tells me that age is a predominant factor. This also tells me that there are a significant number of voters that actually did make the change from not voting for Trump and voting for Biden to voting for Trump in 2020 to 2024. In other words, I don't think that Trump just enjoyed a bunch of new voters. He enjoyed voters who had voted against him before. They voted for him in 2024. And I think most of those voters you would find amongst a younger demographic and a less white demographic. Okay? The Joe Biden theory. It looks like a man who needs an ice cream cone. The Democrats did surprisingly well in the 2020 midterm elections, for sure. Data showed that abortion and democracy were driving issues, but that obscured more than it revealed. A couple of things. Parties, usually the governing party experiences midterm setbacks. Usually the party that's in power is going to get hurt in the midterm elections. Obama called it a shellacking. George W. Bush called it a thumping. Donald Trump didn't call it anything in 2018. He just pretended it didn't happen. But it did happen. And usually the governing party does poorly in midterm elections. This did not happen with the Democrats. That might have disadvantaged them for 2024. Because what happens when you lose as a governing party, it requires you to go beyond your base supporters, to do things that are not popular with the people who are most mobilized to support you, and to expand your electorate and to reach out to a bunch of people that are not your core supporters, that aren't going to agree with all of the messaging all the way down from the party platform, right? And so that makes hard decisions on people. You kind of have to do a little bit outside of the box. For Obama, after the 2012 midterms, he went to Republicans and tried to do debt and deficit reform, tried to tackle the debt and deficit. Not popular with his base, but something that broadened his electorate slightly. We see examples of this in the past. We did not see this with Democrats because they didn't think they lost the 2022 midterms for pretty good reason. Evidence showed that they didn't really lose. They actually won. Now, I say the data showed that abortion and democracy were driving issues, but this obscures more than it reveals because midterm elections are elections in which more mobilized voters are going to the polls. The people who really tune out politics but are still going to vote typically don't go to midterm elections. And so the issues that are really driving your base, you're driving your more mobilized party supporters anyway, issues like abortion and issues like democracy are going to become more salient and visible in the results of the 2020 midterm elections because of that. You don't have a broad base of less engaged voters in the midterm elections. You only have those more mobilized voters, and that might change how you see the midterm elections and how you strategize, right? So the Democrats, they didn't need to broaden their base. They didn't need to make those hard decisions. Biden didn't need to think about hard decisions of running for re-election. Had he been shellacked, had he been thumped in the 2022 midterm elections, he very well might have said, you know what, I'm going to sit out the 2024 election. I've decided not to run. Especially right after the midterm elections, Donald Trump declared his candidacy. It allowed his campaign, his candidacy to focus on donors, focus on messaging, focus on mobilizing voters, focusing on the long game and preparing for the 2024 election. Democrats were twisted in the wind. They didn't know. They won. They're celebrating. Not sure what to do. Is Biden apparently is going to run. Is that a good idea? Didn't have those hard conversations. Biden wasn't forced out at this period of time. He felt like he could run successfully for re-election. Nobody really attended to that issue. And we assumed, Democrats assumed, that abortion and democracy would be enough in 2024. And I say we, us political scientists as well, we kind of assumed that abortion and democracy would remain to be powerful, salient issues. They are salient issues, they just did not have the salience level that other issues did. Trump declares his candidacy. Right after the 2022 midterms, had Biden declared, then he would not seek a second term. He could have immediately blunted Trump's impact. He could have paved the way for a competitive primary season, allowed a Democratic candidate to run a somewhat separated campaign from the Biden administration. There's a reason why vice presidents very often do not elevate into the presidency directly after their term as vice president. It is rare to do. Last time that's happened, I was just talking to my presidency class, George H.W. Bush in 1988. Before that, Martin Van Buren in the 19th century. It's rare. Most vice presidents are failures. The office of the vice presidency has no real codified powers. They're only as successful as a president will make them successful. And a lot of presidents don't make their vice presidents successful. And they kind of just languish in a warm bucket of spit, to use a phrase from the 20th century about the office of the vice presidency. I don't know if anyone knows that clever phrase. But it was described as worth a warm bucket of spit, the office of the vice presidency. And so, it clearly hamstrung Kamala Harris in two ways. It tied her to what was an unpopular Biden administration, but it also brought up one of the more powerful messages from the Republican Party, which is, if you had 4 years to fix these problems, why didn't you fix them then? Without really maybe appreciating the fact that the vice presidency is not a real policy mover and shaker in Washington and doesn't have a lot of influence on the presidency directly. Certainly nothing codified. So, the Biden theory. Now, the takeaway. I think actually this has a substantial effect. I think that this is a powerful factor in the 2024 election results. The problem here is that it's hard to measure, and we're just kind of entertaining alternate history when we think about, oh, what if he would have done this? Oh, this sounds really good. I mean, everything sounds good when it's alternate history if you want it to, right? If it fits your argument. So it's not really something that we can measure and not something that we can really nail down. But I think that my sneaking suspicion, and from others, is that this is a powerful factor. And I think it calls into question Biden's legacy as president. And that'll be an interesting thing that I'm very interested in observing and looking at as a scholar of the presidency and as somebody who follows the American presidency. I'm always interested in presidential legacies and how they develop in history and how we look back in history of presidents. I think it's going to be very interesting to see the legacy of Joe Biden. The only president who's in the Rutherford B. Hayes position, meaning that ensconced between a non-consecutive president, right? Rutherford B. Hayes was in between Grover Cleveland's two administrations. I think that on the whole, there are a lot of policy accomplishments that Biden and the Biden administration can hang their hat on. Policy accomplishments that will be with us long after Joe Biden has left office. In fact, probably long after he's been alive. Economic effects of the Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS Act. I think the Inflation Reduction Act has some pieces and components to it that will be popular with Americans if they're taken away, and Americans realize that they were given by the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm thinking of like capping insulin at $20. That's something that affects Americans directly. I know there's been talk of Republicans repealing the IRA directly. They may, and if they do, there might be some fallout from it for this reason. But all that remains to be seen. But I do think this transition thing is one of the things that will saddle the legacy of Joe Biden. He may have come out looking like roses had Kamala Harris won the 2024 November election, but he comes out smelling not so good because Kamala Harris did not win the November elections, and it may be because of him, or to some substantial degree. This is kind of a subset of that question. The Joe Biden theory is like, maybe we should just talk about the Harris campaign. Did Harris run a bad campaign? Maybe that's partly what's going on here. Well, some of this is subjective, but a strong argument could be made that Harris ran a largely error-free campaign of integrity, and it was pretty much above board. Looked like a pretty successful campaign in a lot of ways. The vice presidential pick looked to be popular, according to polls. It looked like most people thought that she won the debate with Donald Trump, although there were, I think, some slight missteps. One might criticize Harris for not being real concrete and substantive on policy, not being as accessible in terms of interviews and media appearances and other things. On the whole, I would say it was a pretty normal campaign, and I don't see a lot of huge missteps or huge errors. In fact, probably one of the biggest errors was Joe Biden opening his mouth and calling Trump supporters garbage or whatever he insinuated or tried to insinuate or tried to take back. And you didn't see a lot of errors otherwise from the Harris campaign. So I'm going to go out and say that she ran, I think, a pretty strong campaign. In fact, evidence shows that that's the case. In swing states, there was a 3.1 percentage point swing to Trump compared to 2020. That's good for Trump. But look outside the swing states, it was a 6.7 swing for Donald Trump. I think this gap shows the performance of the Harris campaign. That the Harris campaign spent time, energy, and money in those swing states, and it had some effect. It dampened some of what would have been an even more substantial loss to Donald Trump if she hadn't run a good campaign. This is a quote from a blog. Those swing states are where the ads ran. That's where the candidates appeared. That's where both campaigns did everything they could to turn out their supporters. That roughly 3.5 percentage point difference, this is Harris and her campaign. That's what explains that difference, the difference between these two numbers. It suggests that she did run a good campaign, that there was an effect there in mobilizing voters in Pennsylvania and states that mattered to the Democrats. Again, the big drop is in non-swing states. We had, I mentioned to you, a massive drop in vote share, for example, in Illinois, 650,000 votes, but all across this country, especially in swing states, where a lot of people feel like their votes are largely wasted, we saw a collapse of Democratic support, and we saw a rightward shift. County by county data shows tremendous amounts of rightward shift all across this county. We see some pretty significant shifts down here in the Rio Grande Valley, Hispanic Latino voters in the Rio Grande Valley, which used to be a Democratic Party stronghold, now looking like solid Republican. Huge shifts toward the Republicans in what used to be a swing state, Florida, Miami-Dade County, the city of Miami, one of the biggest shifts toward the Republicans. Democratic Party stronghold. Yeah, the state of Florida is probably a safe Republican conservative state, but Miami, the urban area of Miami, still much more Democratic voters than Republican voters. It's a huge Republican Party shift there. New York City, the state which, and I'm not going to get down into the weeds of the geography. Let's look at the state percentage of Republican shift by state. Look at this. Number 1, New York. Number 2, New Jersey, right? No, not a lot of swing states down up here, right? In terms of the largest shifts. The swing states are typically, we have one swing state on this top line list, Arizona. And then you've got another swing state here of Nevada on the second line. And then on the third line, you've got Michigan, right? And then down here, you've got, this is where you have Pennsylvania, and you have Georgia, and you have Wisconsin. And so I think what this suggests as well is that the swing states is not where the Democratic Party collapse was. This is not where the largest percentage in shift in voter share lies. It lies in states that were not swing states, where Democrats did not compete and didn't spend money. I think this indicates a deeper problem with the Democratic Party, one that's been brewing for years and years and years within this party, which is that they don't care to run candidates in rural areas or small town areas of America. They don't spend time or money or attention in middle America, the flyover states, or anything outside of where concentrated Democratic Party votes lie. I think that's a long-term problem for the Democratic Party. It's been a problem that's been talked about and mentioned by the Democratic Party, but I don't see any solutions to it. I saw Kamala Harris choose Tim Walz for vice president, I think as an indication of that problem, and an indication of what the Democrats want to do in solving that problem. But Tim Walz will not be vice president. I also see like the future of the Democratic Party maybe looking a little bit like Jon Tester in Montana. I think there's an irony to Jon Tester losing that Senate seat, which is that the future of politics in Montana is probably going to look a lot like Jon Tester, but he lost. He's not going to be a senator next year. And so I think that the Democratic Party has to think about that in terms of messaging, outreach to ordinary, regular Americans across the political spectrum, not just those who are always plugged into the party. So anyway, that's the vote share. Huge increases there for New York and New Jersey and Florida, California, Massachusetts, Illinois, Texas. I think there's a lot of working class voters disconnected from politics, disengaged, Maybe many of them voted somewhat lazily or not thinking too much about it for the Democratic Party, just because that's always what they had done, or that's what their friends and family do around them. But that changed substantially in 2024. And so it begs the question as to why, and we're developing some theories as to why, but I think the strongest theories are to remain, and this is one of them. The economy. I think, in one way, this election is not that surprising. We should look at a lot of the results and say we shouldn't be surprised by seeing X, Y, and Z. We shouldn't be surprised by the fact that the economy was a major driver. We shouldn't be surprised by the fact that a lot of voters had made up their mind, actually, probably even before the campaign started. Maybe before Donald Trump's extraordinary attempted assassination in Pennsylvania, or even before Joe Biden's extraordinary collapse in the debate in June 21 of this summer. Maybe before that, a lot of Americans had already decided who they were going to vote for. They wanted to vote for change, and they wanted to kick out the incumbents and the people that were in power. I'll get to that theory in a moment. Let's just stick with the economy first. Inflation, housing costs, consumer confidence, all critical factors for voters, especially those low propensity, disengaged voters. These are the voters that think that politics is directly tied to the price of gas at the gas pump. I'm not going to debate whether or not it is or whatever. I mean, you can all have your peace of mind about it. I do think that government has obviously a role to play in our political economy at the top level, and there are ways that that government economic policy will affect on Main Street the price of commodities and other things, but obviously it's very, very complicated how that happens. But nonetheless, I think a lot of low propensity voters, disengaged voters, those are the ones that are just going to make a direct connection. They're like, these are more transactional voters as well. What are you doing for me right now? Right? Like, I don't, I feel bad maybe for people who are suffering in Ukraine, but that doesn't affect me. That's not my life. I don't, X, Y, and Z. Like, these policies don't necessarily affect my concrete everyday life. But what is the cost of groceries? What is the cost of gas? These are the things. These are transactional voters. They expect government to deliver to them concrete and substantive things that they can take to go about their daily lives in a good way. And they're not thinking broadly about policy all the time, or the kind of indirect ways they might affect the overall, overall society or the world, et cetera, et cetera. Not to say that if they did think that way that they're all going to vote for Democrats, but these types of voters, I think in this way, much more transactionally, and therefore it helps us make sense of why they swung so substantially toward the Republicans in 2024. From that same PBS exit poll, 6 out of 10 voters said that the economy was the primary factor in their vote. No, it's not the same PBS exit poll. It's a different one, because I just said that was 4 out of 10. I'll have to go back to my sources and look at it. One said 4 out of 10, the other one said 6 out of 10. And I'm still digging into where those exit polls were and what the difference might mean. Sorry about that. It's an especially strong factor among Black, Hispanic, Latino, and younger voters. These are voters who are coming into an economy that's not very good, and that dealt with a lot of issues of dislocation. These are also voters that grew up in the age of COVID. Like, they kind of came into adulthood in COVID, many of them. Many of them maybe have still been in high school during COVID. COVID, I think, was a really traumatic and socially dislocating event that weighed heavily on the psychological aspects of our health and well-being, but how we also translate our own personal health and well-being into that well-being of our society and our communities and our country. And I think that there was just this darkness that weighed upon a lot of people, especially younger people, who are coming into a world like, why am I even in this world? Why can't I have another world? And they're upset and they're disappointed with everything that's happening in a variety of ways. And I think they're expressing an anger, a sadness, a disconnection from maybe broader elements of society, certainly of a promise and hope that policy can fix some of the solutions that they have. And I think with those sentiments in mind. 2/3 of voters rated the economy as not so good or poor, compared to just 1/3 who rated it as excellent or good, according to network exit polls. Of the voters who rated the economy negatively, 69% voted for Trump. Obviously, that's a huge margin. And so those who think the economy is doing poorly or badly are very, very likely to throw out incumbents. And I think that explains, has a big role to play. We might talk economics. I'm not an economist, so we don't have to. We're doing politics. And so, but we could debate whether or not the health of the economy is what it is, where is it, should these people really be recognizing a more beneficial economy to them or not, or whatever. But the simple fact of the matter is the perception from many ordinary Americans is this economy is doing terrible and is not helping them at all. I think one of the elements here that was overlooked, we often emphasize gas prices and the price of eggs or bacon or whatever, but one element that's consistently overlooked here, housing prices. And housing price, you want to buy a home, you need to get a mortgage, your interest rate for your mortgage has gone up, right? And housing for rentals, for home ownership, increasingly out of the realm of realizing for so many Americans. You look at the percentage of homes purchased on the market today by first-time home buyers is down now to historic lows. We're like talking 27%. Most of the homes purchased on our market are second home buyers or corporations or businesses or other things. And so average ordinary Americans, especially younger Americans, especially non-white persons of color who do not have the kind of same privileged histories, intergenerational privileged histories of accumulating wealth, that are looking to buy a home, looking to become prosperous. I think this is why we saw so many, for example, black voters in Georgia. There has been, I think, an economic renaissance of black American prosperity, especially in a place like Georgia. Atlanta has more black millionaires than any other city in America. You have a lot of prosperous, upwardly mobile black Americans in that area, across the country, but especially concentrated in that area. And a lot of those are looking at these economic conditions, and they're thinking to themselves, all of the difficulties intergenerationally, going back to their parents and their grandparents, the difficulties associated with prejudice and discrimination that put them into poverty, anchored them to poverty, anchored them to a place where they couldn't get out and prosper in America. And I think that those fears become salient in these kinds of economically vulnerable times for these voters. So dismissing inflation concerns, not necessarily a good idea for Democrats. Maintaining Trump tariffs, did that have an effect on inflation prices? I'm skeptical of that, I'm not quite sure. But I do think overall that the economy is a substantial factor in seeing the Donald Trump success in the Electoral College. Not just down ballot Republicans, and in fact, actually, maybe not down ballot Republicans as much as Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump made much more out of the economic issues than some of the down ballot Republicans. He had a louder mouthpiece to do so, and I think he framed the issue symbolically in ways that were largely successful with these demographics. A lot of Democrats thought, well, Trump is not talking about the economy that much. And Republicans grumbled about this as well. There was criticisms that Trump was too busy talking about pets being eaten or whatever, you name it, and not enough about the economy. But I don't think that we saw that in those results. I think what we saw in these results is that a lot of people saw Donald Trump as having economic messages. Trump will fix it. That was his big message. A lot of people saw that through the economy. The establishment theory ultimately, I think, is the biggest theory, and it includes the economic theory. The establishment theory is big enough that we can put the economic theory inside of it, and we can say that this is really the biggest driver. Around the world, incumbent parties, incumbent governments have been thrown out of office regardless of ideology. The UK just threw out their conservative government that had been governing for quite some time. It didn't matter what their ideology is. It mattered that they were the governing party during all of the horrible years of COVID and post-COVID. And they want to blame those who are in power. It doesn't matter what their policies are, what their beliefs are necessarily. It matters that they were in power during a horrible time, and we want to get rid of them so we don't have to think about that time anymore. And I think that explains a lot. People across the globe are tired of this pandemic-era political leadership in which that they associate this leadership with chaos, instability, government overreach, inflation, overall discontent and public melees. I think there's just like the feeling that those who are in government are saddled and tied to these kinds of sentiments in ways that are really hard to overcome. Democrats were in for a major political defeat no matter what they did, and no matter what candidate they threw up there. There's an argument to be made, and I think it's a powerful argument. I think understanding that Kamala, if you are of the mind that Kamala Harris ran an excellent campaign, and we can see some evidence of that. I think that that also helps strengthen this idea. You know, I don't know if you could find more Democratic candidacies for the presidency that ran as well as the Kamala Harris campaign, in my opinion. Now, maybe we could say, again, going back to the Joe Biden theory, that the Joe Biden theory has some weight. Maybe Kamala Harris needed a longer runway. Maybe she needed more time to run a campaign. We could make that argument, but I'm not so sure we could spin out an alternative history in which we imagine a better candidate running a better campaign, or at least not by much. Trump's anti-establishment ethos, in fact, is a perfect fit for the anti-establishment moment. This is like, one might argue that Trump, with all of the vulnerabilities, criminal indictments, criminal convictions, January 6th, just his very nature being a little toxic or conflict-based or whatever, however you want to describe it. I'm trying to be ecumenical, but you know what I mean. One might make the argument that only a perfect storm could bring him back into office, and I think we got a perfect storm. I think we really did. We had exactly the perfect candidate for the perfect moment. Trump has run as anti-establishment since he came into political life in 2015. And I think that that message was it was a good message for 2016, which is why he surprised the world and won the presidency then, but it's almost even a perfect fit for 2024 in our post-COVID world. We're angry with the establishment, and Trump's anti-establishment ethos is like a perfect fit. We would have probably picked any anti-establishment candidate anyway, but we got the anti-establishment candidate who happens to be genuinely anti-establishment, so fits the moment. A distrust of institutions is really a core element of right-wing populism around the world, even before COVID. And this really is at the heart of Trumpian ideology, if you will. There's a little bit of a debate amongst us political scientists whether or not Trump has an ideology. I do think Trump is an ideology. Trumpism is a thing. And at its core, Trumpism is skeptical of all institutions. Educational institutions, health institutions, government institutions, media institutions. It is anti-institutional. And that is, I think, its core. And so it was a perfect fit for the time. The takeaway, this includes the economy theory to a substantial degree, and you put these things together, this really is the strongest explanation for Republican Party success and Democratic Party failure. You see this massive rightward shift, and from 2016, 2020, and then 2024, you see that shift going where communities or industries or geographical areas, etc. I'll get to geographical areas in the next slide. Even when they were going more Democratic in the last two elections, they have swung substantially rightward. More educated counties in the United States of America moving further to the left. 2024, they do a reverse. They do a swing back. We see this throughout the country. I didn't get data enough for the others. This is a little too early. But huge rightward shifts. Note here, actually, that in very conservative areas, the shift rightward was less than in, look at Massachusetts, right? You see a much larger shift in places that are not traditionally Republican. I think this partly tells me that actually you can't move much more to the right in Oklahoma. Like there's not a lot of ceiling above there for like the growth, you know, so it's not going to go much farther. There's been a lot of talk in Kansas about a movement to Democrats, liberal voters increasing, et cetera, et cetera. We did see that in the last two elections, but we saw a reversal of that in Kansas, as we saw throughout the country. Iowa makes a huge right-wing turn in 2016, a little bit of a correction, right back to right-wing turn again in 2024. New Mexico made one of the hugest gains, county by county level. New Mexico is one of the largest and most substantial rightward shifts in the country. Florida, one of the more substantial as well. New York and the upper northeast as well. You look at some of these suburbs, all liberal suburbs, Democratic Party strongholds, making huge shifts. Wayne County, Michigan, 9.1%. Atlanta suburbs, I'm sorry, that's only 1%. I thought that was 10%. 9.1% for Wayne County. And much talk about Wayne County. Black voters, Arab American voters, et cetera, et cetera. They were vocal. They were voicing these things in the polls. A lot of people thought, well, polls are one thing, but are they really going to turn out for the election? Are they really going to vote for Donald Trump? We saw a lot of Arab Americans in Michigan vote for Donald Trump. And so we'll find out what happens with that relationship in the future. I don't know if that's going to be all that successful, but some very interesting developments, obviously. So very quickly, just looking toward Trump in 2025, and what might we expect? Well, given this analysis, given all the things that I've said here, I think that we might say that this overall rightward shift in the electorate, it might not last. I don't think that we need to all be of a certain, some kind of certainty that these shifts are going to be permanent. They could be, but I think it's going to depend on how Republicans govern. That really is going to be the crucial element here. Are they going to deliver on promises in ways that make America better, make America safer, make Americans feel better, and make Americans feel safer? That remains to be seen. If they do, I think we can talk about a permanent correction within party politics, but these are low propensity voters, younger voters. They're notoriously fickle, and they're not subject to, durable patterns that we measure from election to election cycle. Other voters, like Black American voters, reliably Democratic, that shift is so recent, so abrupt, that we might expect some substantial corrections in the other direction. That might not last either. Black American voters are not typically at home in the Republican Party in terms of the longevity of them being there. And so we might suspect that things go wrong in terms of policy, especially from a viewpoint or perspective of Black American voters. We might expect those voters to change their mind pretty quickly from where they went in 2024. Republicans, they're the unifying governing party now with all the responsibility and accountability that entails. And we'll see to what effect that they're able to hold on to their majority and successfully advance policy. There was a lot of chaos in 2017 in terms of the Republican Party not really knowing what to do with their majority. They finally settled on repealing Obamacare by like May or June of 2017. That didn't even work out. And even from Republican Party standards, it wasn't a very successful first year in office. It wasn't until later on in that first year that they got rolling with their tax cuts and other things. I don't think that that's going to be the case this year. I think we're going to have more movement, concrete policy movement, and more outcomes right away from the incoming 2025 Trump administration. We don't have any Russia collusion either in 2025. I think that actually helps a number of things. It sort of clears the air. Trump won't be able to just simply blame the Democrats. I do think in terms of, down here on this last point, resistance as a Democratic Party strategy, I'm interested in your viewpoints and thoughts. Let me say, if Republicans do not deliver tangible results, then their majority might be in trouble. So then it becomes a question, what do Democrats do? What do liberals, progressives do? What does the party do, et cetera, et cetera? The question is, how much do we resist and to what extent? I'll give you my thought, and I'm a little bit of an outsider. As a political scientist, I'm not as much of a partisan as maybe some of you. But here's my thought. The Democrats spent most of their political capital and actually shaping most of their party identity around an anti-Trump. They were an anti-Trump party. I don't think that that was successful at all, really. And I don't think it was successful in Trump's first term. I think the Democrats are actually advantaged by taking a step back and allowing the Republicans to govern. And allowing the Republicans to develop their own criticisms from the inside. For example, I know that the pick for Attorney General, Matt Gaetz from Florida, shocks and dismays a number of, most Republicans, in fact. Matt Gaetz is not well liked in Washington at all. And I think it probably benefits the Democrats to allow Republicans to work that out for themselves. And to not worry too much about resistance in that regard. Their caucus in the House and in the Senate is very tight. They're going to vote no for most of these things anyway. They don't need to make a big noise about it. They don't need to engage. They don't have to have that be the prominent feature of the public discourse that they offer as a party to our politics of the moment. I think that they need to go back to the drawing board and think of substantive, concrete policies that have nothing to do with Trump, that have to do with voters and what the voters are interested in and what the voters want out of a political party. And that's going to take a lot of work. That's going to be hard. It's not going to be without fights and conflicts within the party, but I think that that's where the solution lies. And it might sound like that's an accommodationist position, allow for Donald Trump to do whatever he wants and whatever outcomes come out of that. But again, I'm interested in a viable alternative that sounds like a better one. I don't know if there is a better one out there, just thinking strategically. I know it took up a lot of time, but does anyone have any thoughts or questions or observations? Yes, in the back?
So you said you don't necessarily expect the swing to last.
Yeah.
If things do swing back the other direction in 4 years, what do you expect the long-term effects of a Trump presidency to be, like the things that will not swing back afterward?
That's a really, really good question. foreign policy and international relations in particular. The president has an outside role in developing foreign policy and advancing our foreign policy interests abroad. We've already seen a number of really challenging Trump loyalty picks when it comes to international relations and foreign affairs. The D&I pick of Tulsi Gabbard is worrisome for a lot of people who are concerned about Russian fascism, which is, by the way, is real fascism. There's a real fascist country in the world. And if you look and you research what fascism is and compare it to Putin's increasingly totalitarian government, tell me where I'm wrong in that assessment. I'd like to know. And so, I think that there's some deep worry there with regards to foreign policy and what might ultimately happen. I do suspect that a lot of those outcomes are going to be felt much more in the international environment than here at home, first and foremost. So, in terms of international relations, now Russia and Ukraine is only one element of that. I think there are lots of other areas, and I don't know how everything's going to pan out. I'm not a predictor. I'm better looking at what happened and trying to explain than telling you what's going to happen in the future. But I think that we might have some more substantial effects. And, I wouldn't be surprised. This world is a different world than Trump came in 2017. Trump came in with a pretty good hand in 2017. The economy, pretty solid. The international environment, somewhat fairly stable. I mean, there were dislocations and instabilities. I've been talking about Russia's invasion of Ukraine since 2014, 2013. I mostly blame Barack Obama for the unraveling of our Ukraine policy. I mean, but all three presidents have a role to play in that. But anyway, 2017, the world looked a very different place, and it was a more stable place, and it was a more predictable place. Now it is far less predictable, and it is far less stable. And I think it remains to be seen how Trump is going to deal with this very different reality, a different ecosystem. There are a number of other things I could probably point out, but I'll just stick with that one. Yeah, Maya.
Specifically with Hispanic voters, why do you think so many of them shifted towards Trump, even though his campaign actively acted against this specific population?
Yeah, the education, non-education divide looks to be the one that grows very, very large. Hispanic Latino voters have a lower percentage of higher education degrees, et cetera, et cetera. We see this across the board, that those who, there is an elitism, non-elitism that is driving this. When I talk about college-educated voters and non-college educated voters, don't get me wrong, I'm not talking about people who are uneducated, okay? I'm just talking about people who, for a variety of reasons, money or access or whatever, don't have a higher college education degree. A lot of those people feel looked down upon, ridiculed, castigated in our society, and they see a society of elites and those who are left behind. And that's just the way it is. And I think it crosses over a lot of racial and ethnic categories, and I think that has strong explanatory power. I think also a lot of working class Hispanic Latino voters are working class and are voting on the economy. I also do see a substantial number of Hispanic Latino voters who are actually supportive of mass deportations. Look at the border. Look at the border politics of the Rio Grande Valley Hispanic Latino voters shifting over to the Republican Party. They're looking at security of their communities and seeing a decline in security and stability in their communities, a rise in crime, a rise in organized crime, and all of the spilling over of the chaos of the border affecting their communities directly, and they're being driven to the polls by that message from Donald Trump. So a lot of Hispanic Latino voters don't see it as directly against their interests. They see it actually as aligned with their interests. And I think it goes back to that point I made about a lot of voters might not really be taking seriously how extensive mass deportations might be. That it's not going to affect me, it's not going to affect my family. I've been here for so long. Like, I can't imagine that. And I'm not so sure. I will tell you, I'm very concerned about some of the outcomes of immigration policy in a Trump administration. They've already been somewhat comfortable targeting legal, documented immigrants, like Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio. I don't know how far they will go. I'm not saying that they are going to target or detain legal, documented immigrants, but I think the door has been opened and the conversation is happening. So, I mean, we should at least recognize that that's what's going on. Hopefully that explains some of it. I think it goes much deeper. I think you could write a whole book on that topic, and we don't have time for a book, but I think that that's a starting point of thinking about some of the problematics there and some of the things, some of the ways in which Hispanic Latino voters are seeing the electorate and the politics. Yeah, David.
Do you think that the late dropout of Biden from the ticket
Yeah.
affected the outcome?
Yeah, so as I say, I think that that's probably third on the list of explanatory powers. I do think that that has a role to play. I think that Biden dropping out late in the game, Democratic strategists thought that would be a good thing. Only 100 days out, like we can run a short campaign, enthusiasm will remain high, coast into the White House. Clearly did not happen. Clearly an indication, maybe American voters are used to very long campaigns. We have inordinately long campaigns in America, unlike most other countries in the world. You know, campaigns start years in advance. Maybe we're so used to it that that it doesn't fit the sensibilities of our electorate, and it didn't allow for easy adjustment. I think especially low propensity voters, disengaged voters. They're busy working and living their lives and trying to pay their bills, and here some old guy who's president can't even like do a debate and completely collapses, and they're like, oh my God, these are the people in charge? I mean, this is why I deal with all these problems. And who is this person? The vice president? And I think name recognition matters a great deal in politics. Research shows that. The more you recognize someone's name, the more likely you are going to vote for them. Voters have a hard time voting for someone they don't know, even if they might align with the policy. So I don't know who that person is. They're not comfortable voting for them. I think that those factors all play into that. And yes, so I do think that Biden dropping out so late in the game has some kind of effect. Yeah, Clark.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things that you haven't mentioned a whole lot. Maybe they're subsumed under some of these in your mind, but you know, there's a number of individuals who point to a couple of factors. One is cultural backlash. In fact, Pippin Norris and was it Ronald Englehart have a text on a book on this, and it's not just in the United States. It is this authoritarian populism that's been in other countries as well. But we've had major cultural shifts. And just looking at the public's perception, the polling on gay marriage, and how rapid that was. There's perhaps arguably never been as rapid a change in the American public's view of a significant public policy issue as there has been with gay marriage. How quickly that occurred and how much it reversed. And I think that's part of what many people say, and that's why the word woke had such power. Because that encapsulated everything that was the change that a lot of people didn't like. And that whole thing about Make America Great Again is saying, we got to go back to a country you used to know. I know, just personal anecdotes, but I know people who, that's why they like Trump, because they don't like the direction. And people like Bill Maher would keep saying how he thought the left had really went too far. Mm-hmm. And that movement too far is the way the pendulum swings back and forth. And that's why cultural backlash seems to suggest that. But the other thing that seems to be an issue for a lot of people is that the United States isn't ready to elect a woman. Hillary Clinton underperformed. Mm-hmm. Kamala Harris. I don't know that you can make as strong a case for saying, well, it's because Biden stayed in too long. Maybe if he'd have stayed in, he would have done better than her. He at least could have said, vociferously said, these are good economic policies. You give me another 4 years and you're going to see this. The Wall Street Journal just came out and said, Trump's going to again inherit economy on the upswing. He got lucky before with coming in with Obama and things moving up. He's going to get that again.
Yeah, well, a couple of things. I think, I try to speak that in a couple of issues. Establishment, anti-establishment. I think that cultural backlash you're talking about, it's connected to it. It's a substantial part of it. There's a lot of overlap there. I think also in talking about identity politics, we talked about the argument of maybe this is because Kamala Harris is a woman and the disadvantages inherent in that. And I think that these are things that we're going to be thinking about and digging into a lot more deeply. I don't, I can't definitively say that obviously gender had no role to play in the election. I don't, especially after that debate performance, I have a hard time believing that Joe Biden would do better than Kamala Harris in November. I know I was asked by Daniel, you asked me, right? What if Joe Biden had not had the disastrous debate performance? And that brings up an interesting question. But again, we're kind of speculating in alternative history, and we're only going to be, it's good conversation, but I don't know if we can measure this in any way. It remains to be seen how durable this cultural backlash really is. Clearly, it's got cachet and salience, and it is a long-term and global phenomenon. I want to see where it develops. I think there's still a lot of time here in which we're going to look at the rise of right-wing populisms around the world and what does it indicate about our future politics? Fatin.
All right, thank you. So obviously Trump is coming back, and so is Steve Miller,
yeah,
who was the architect of all the policies that made it difficult, for international students or foreign workers in the United States to have a legal status. They tried to attack H-1B visa holders and so on and so forth. Trump recently, during the campaign, he I think was talking to a group of high-tech leaders in California, and he mentioned that international students who will graduate from the United States will automatically get a green card.
Yeah.
Does he have the power to do that? And
No. He doesn't have the power to do that, and that's a really good example of some of the internal contradictions of the Trump movement and the Republican Party right now that they're going to have to reconcile and deal with. You've got a Steve Miller wing, you've got a Elon Musk wing. They look very differently and have different perspectives on issues like immigration, and specifically on issues of like, one of our great exports in this country is higher education. We bring in bright minds from all over the world and educate them, and some of them stay, but a great many of them go back, and it is beneficial to this country in a number of ways, but we've seen some direct attacks on this, and I think that there's some reason to be worried about that. But again, these internal contradictions within the Trump administration, where Trump actually embodies and embraces some of these contradictions, like saying we should give a pathway to citizenship or green cards to those who come and study in this country, and yet that seems to be a clear contradiction of the underlying policies of immigration that he advances and that individuals that work for him advance. So I don't have anything for you, Fatin, in terms of like what's going to ultimately happen, but I do think this is only one of many internal contradictions within the Republican Party. Tariffs, this is a pro-working party. This is now the working class party of America. It's also the pro-business party. You can see how those things can conflict, right? Tariffs with traditional Republicans in Congress. Are they going to like that? Inflation and tariff. A number of different ways that the economic policy has these internal contradictions within them that I think are going to be very hard to reconcile. And I'm not so sure how they're going to reconcile them. I think that there is this, we're likely to see a lot of very interesting policy fights and battles in an unusual arena. And that arena is not the polarized party conflict that exists between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. I suspect we're going to see a lot of these within the Republican Party as a governing party. And I don't know how that will develop, but I suspect that that's where we're going to see more and more political conflict.
Okay, thank you everyone so much for your engagement. Thank you all for coming out. Please grab some more food and please make sure you have signed in. I'm not sure where the sign in is. It's back here. Please make sure you sign in. This really helps us just count everyone. Thank you to Dr. Steinmetz for your amazing speech. Let's give the speaker a round of applause.